Hello, I'm excited to be here. I haven't been to a Clojure meetup, I think, in it's been probably 6 years. It's been a while, so I'm really excited that Lightweight Labs has decided to bring it back. There is a lot of Clojure activity in New York, and I think it'd be great to get everybody talking again. So to sort of kick it off, I came up with a talk. This talk is called ClojureScript from First Principles or CLJS is a damn good jQuery. What year is this? jQuery, come on. Don't you mean React? But actually, I first wrote about React 11 and a half years ago. Like that time, the time that has passed between when I wrote about React in 2013, 2014 is longer than the time from when I first started writing JavaScript and React came out. When I started in 2005, 2006 doing JavaScript development, there were like two sources of truth on the internet. One was Douglas Crockford's posts about JavaScript and how JavaScript works, and the other one was PPK, because jQuery didn't exist yet. The only way you could write cross-browser code was to go to PPK and look for what you were doing and then copy and paste all the things into your browser and then pray that it would work, because there weren't even any debugging tools. You couldn't debug in any major browser. This is, for those of you who remember, this is Firebug. Firebug was an extension you installed into Firefox to get debugging in at least one browser. Fast forward, those are the sort of dark ages, and then around 2011, Rich Hickey and Think Relevance came out with ClojureScript. ClojureScript, I was actually a Clojure hobbyist. I had done some work doing open source Clojure libraries, and then ClojureScript came out. I was doing JavaScript in the New York Times. I was like, oh, this is really exciting. I can actually take my sort of Clojure knowledge and use it to build sort of interactive web applications. One of the things that was interesting was that Rich did a thing which I think will make more sense in the course of this talk, which is that he decided to ship ClojureScript with fairly deep integration to Google Clojure Compiler, which actually at the time people didn't even know about. Like in 2011, people were talking about things like Bower and barely beginning to talk about getting their dependency from NPM. And everybody was like, I'll never compile JavaScript ever. And then, that's the only thing people do now, compiling JavaScript. Anyways, the real interesting thing about Google Clojure Compiler was back then Google sort of realized it's really important that we be able to write very rich interactive applications, but the final artifact to be very small. So Google Clojure still to this day has one of the best tree shaking algorithms, and we'll see that working. I actually made this little example. Hopefully it shows up. Yeah. So what happened there? Anyways, this example I took Notch's demo of Minecraft as a demo he did for the canvas, and I ported to ClojureScript. And this is all written in ClojureScript, just direct ported. And I used some macros to make the syntax cleaner. And it's implicit in every ClojureScript file that you're including the entire standard library. And then you can see here, and the entire standard library generates about 50,000 lines of JavaScript. And yet you're only seeing 3.7K. So it showed that as long as they didn't use any ClojureScript primitives, right, Google Clojure could detect that. And I get a very small dependency. And that's very, very good. This is actually a level of precision that still doesn't really exist in JavaScript with the standard tooling. And the point, this for those of you that do web dev, I mean, this should be a graph that's very familiar. Every year that people talk about this, yet nothing seems to be turning this graph around. This is the graph of web pages getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and slower. And I think that it's not off the mark to say that I think my experience of what websites generally are is relatively degraded in 2025 compared to how it was in 2012. And that should give us pause, because in theory, people are using TypeScript. You got types. Your programs are going to be better. People are using better tooling. It's like, why isn't the quality of software improving? There seems to be a sort of negative inverse correlation. Anyways, back in 2013, right? So this thing called React appeared. And this is, remember, when React first came out, it was a script tag. You just included a script tag in your page. There were no dependencies. There was no React select or React autocomplete or React date picker or any of that stuff. You're just like, I'm just going to write this little thing on my little part of my page, and it's going to be way simpler than if I did use jQuery. It's going to be declarative. And this is what actually caused all the excitement. It's very different. If you're going to React now, you're looking at oh, I'm going to make this app, and you're loading all these dependencies, and it's huge, and you're just grabbing things, a grab bag of stuff you're putting together. But that's not how React was in the beginning. In the very beginning, it was just a this semantically simpler way to deal with the web. So I think we sort of miss an opportunity. And in fact, React being so popular gets a lot of, I think, undeserved hate, because it's not React itself, right? It's not React itself that I think is a problem. Complaining about React or any particular framework in JavaScript, it's a little bit, kind of like complaining about the location of the deck chairs. When you go look, and you don't have to look very far, I found this blog post, which we're not going to read, but this blog post is, a typical thing you find about like, how do we, we have so much JavaScript. What are the things you can do? This is a 17-minute read. This is a 17-minute read. The very first thing is the myth. There is no simple fix to this problem. There's no simple thing you can do. There's no magic switch you can put on in Webpack to make it work. They literally describe going through every single import in their entire code base and rewriting each one by hand, so that what they do is, instead of importing a thing at the top level, because the top level has side effects, they're importing only each little thing they need. They're writing custom Webpack plugins to automatically detect something that's not, they don't want to include anymore. They're realizing, oh, they're generating polyfills for all this stuff that they don't care about. So it's sort of like this thing. It's just a giant foot gun, right? There's foot guns everywhere. It's like an entire chocolate factory of foot guns. But isn't this a talk about ClojureScript? This is not a talk about, isn't this, like, why am I talking so much about JavaScript? And the truth is that in ClojureScript, one of the biggest ways, and one of the most common ways that we do interactive apps is to use React. And we are using these React dependencies. And so therefore, we actually take on all the problems that JavaScript people experience. We experience them. We experience the churn. We experience the breaking changes, all this stuff. We share the same problems. So this is from the JavaScript 2024 survey. It's a really great survey. It's very comprehensive. And this item number 3 is, what's the big problem? Managing dependencies. And number 4 is build tools, right? So these things that are extremely important to getting anything done are 2 of the biggest pain points. And what's interesting is I want to point out that if you strip away, like I'm building a ClojureScript, and there's nothing wrong with building ClojureScript React apps. I'm not like saying that's a bad thing, but if you strip away and you look at the essentials of what ClojureScript does, ClojureScript out the door was meant to solve this managing dependencies and the build tool problem. This is a different slide, like what's JavaScript missing? And the second line item is JavaScript doesn't have a standard library, right? So one of the biggest struggles on the web today is I just want to do date math with dates. I want to add a time interval to a date, and I want it to be localized to a particular country. And I don't want that to be like a 300K thing that, yeah, sure, it gets gzipped to 40K, but it's just a really big dependency. I just want to do one little string. People want this standard library, but that's actually what ClojureScript did out of the box. Like ClojureScript gives you this very large standard library of Clojure functions, but on top of that, you also got Google Clojure Library. Google Clojure Library has things like you want to validate emails, you want internationalization, and you don't want to add this giant blob to your final dependency. Those were sorted out back in 2011, 14 years ago. And this talk is really to get even, I feel like even in the ClojureScript community, people aren't quite aware what primitives does Clojure deliver, and I think we should revisit that and sort of embrace them. And again, it's OK if you're doing React stuff, but for other people that are looking for alternative ways, I actually think ClojureScript is a great place to start from, and it avoids a lot of the, in my opinion, some of the sort of potholes you encounter when you're doing straight JavaScript dev. So ClojureScript from first principles. I mean, it's not a Lisp if you don't have a REPL. So here I have a very simple project that I'm going to demonstrate. And hold on. Why can't I? Oh, here we go. OK. So I have a little deps edom file. This is using Clojure tools CLI. So you can use anything, but I think tools CLI now is the sort of nice, straightforward way. It's very similar to the idea of a package JSON. I have 2 dependencies. I have some little scripts here, like if you're used to writing the little script thing in package JSON. I have a way to build my project, and I can start a REPL. So I'm going to start a REPL here. And I'm going to close this. OK. And without doing that much, I have, this is a REPL to the browser, right? So what's actually happening is I wrote something right here, and it actually compiled it, and it sent it to the browser as JavaScript, and that was evaluated, and the result was sent back, right? So I actually can remote control the browser. So if I look at this code, and I have this hello, so what does hot code reloading look like? I can go, let's edit this, and let's add some exclamation points. I can go cljs nyc.core, and I go reload. So, you know, people think of reloading as like a tooling problem, but actually semantically in a Lisp, reloading is a sort of fundamental idea. It's a fundamental idea. You can reload programs. I can change a single definition. So that, the browser didn't refresh, right? I recompiled the whole namespace, and that got loaded in the browser. And again, I'm not anti-Shadow. Shadow is so cool. For those of you that know Clojure, Shadow is amazing. It's definitely helped with adoption. But I think a lot of people have forgotten that out of the box, ClojureScript has already like a lot of power built in. So what's the next thing I want to show? Forgot about this. So besides just being a REPL, you know, one thing that people really like is that that I really like, and I think a lot of people enjoy, is that the REPL is sort of a conversational interface. Like AI is such a big thing. Like Lisp is conversational from like its very foundation. So I can be like, how do I use this function called first? And then I get a doc string, I get the signature. But this actually works in ClojureScript for Google Clojure namespaces as well. So I'm going to require a goog string, and I go doc goog string trim, right? So a lot of people don't know that we actually collect the signatures and the doc strings for all the Google Clojure namespaces. In addition, there's externs for all public web SDKs that Google creates externs for to make the Google Clojure compiler work. So actually, and that's a bit of work, we're not done with that, but eventually you'd be able to be in a REPL and you'd be able to be like, okay, how do I use that? How do I use web crypto? Or how do I use this new temporal API? And you could do that from your REPL. You wouldn't have to go anywhere else. And then, okay, so we saw hot reload. And so, you know, you're like, that's cool. What happens if I compile this? You just said, yeah, let's look. Let's see how much code I generated here. There's this focus problem. Sorry, apologies. So if I open out and I go, how big is this? So there's 7 megs of JavaScript in this folder. 7 megabytes. Create React app, eat your heart out. I'm going to go release. Okay, and the other thing that's really interesting is that in 2025, what I just did, which is I advanced compiled 7 megabytes of JavaScript, and that took 1.5 seconds. When I saw the first ClojureScript demo, that took like 40 seconds, right? On modern hardware, 1.5 seconds to take 7 megabytes of JavaScript, and then out the other end, we get 3K. Right? I don't even need to gzip that. And so what this is telling you is that even though I've loaded a datetime library, even though I've loaded the entire Clojure standard library, the only thing my program did was console log. And Google Clojure sees all that JavaScript and says, well, you didn't use any of it. We're just going to get rid of it. So let's use it, and let's see how much that sort of costs. I'm going to do, this is something that every JavaScript person needs to do. They want to just do some date arithmetic in the browser. So let's recompile. And then see 14K, and then we can compress that, and it's 5K. So like, you know, Moment.js by itself is 40K with all that stuff. Now people use Day.js, but Day.js, it makes you go through all these hoops. I have to find each individual import, and I have to compose all the plugins, and then finally I can do date arithmetic or get localization. So here I'm going to change my build. And I'm gonna compile this for a different locale, Germany. Whoops. Well, see there was the US one because it defaults to the US. If I refresh, there in Germany. And again, I'm not a human compiler trying to make an optimal build. That's not my problem. So let's keep going. All right. So things to work on. So hopefully that open, those of you that are familiar, hopefully that's like, yeah, I should check out what ClojureScript does just out of the box. I should revisit some of those things. Um, for those that are new to Clojure or ClojureScript, that should be kind of eye-opening. It's like, wow, you didn't use a crazy build tool, you didn't have very many flags, and it just did what you wanted it to do out of the box. That's also very nice. But there are things to work on. It's not like things are done. I have renewed interest in this problem. It would be great to see full support of all Clojure namespaces, all the standard browser APIs. That'd be great for ClojureScript developers. You can just get that in a REPL. That would be awesome. You don't have to leave the REPL to do what you want. There's some, also some basic visibility problems. I think a lot of the reason people aren't familiar with this stuff is because we don't do a good job in sort of the ClojureScript community at the moment making these docs available on the ClojureScript site. That there's one place for you to go and say, those are all the APIs, right? Like you're just like, I just never knew there was a thing to validate emails, or there was already an autocompleter built in, or how does internationalization work? There's just not a place where we aggregate that data, that information. Same for the UI components. There's lots of interesting UI components. Like Google's, the rich text editor that Google uses in all their properties, that's actually in Google Clojure library. Very fancy. It'd be great if you provided translation to ClojureScript. Again, so people are like, yes, I can just look at these docs and I can do most basic web tasks. I never have to go to NPM for a dependency for typical things. And then I think it would be great, and there's some basic things like, it'd be cool if it did live hot reload. That would be a great sort of first user experience. This is sort of like a more speculative thing. I think one thing that's missing is that, it's not obvious from what I've shown is that, Google provides all these tools for manipulating the DOM, but that's sort of mutable stuff, and it's not that fun. Something that arose from React that people might not be aware of is this thing called morphing the DOM, right? So React has this concept of virtual DOM, but then there are projects like HTMX, and there's a new thing called Datastar, but they started using, for building RESTful apps, they were like, we want to build a completely RESTful app, and we want the server to send all the HTML, but instead of causing a page refresh, we'll morph the DOM into the new state so that it's a much more seamless SPA-like experience, even though the entire thing was written in the traditional RESTful style. You can see this in 37 Signals. They talked about the new Turbo, and they're actually using idiomorph. Idiomorph to basically morph the DOM to the new state. Scrolls preserved, inputs are preserved. But that's really great because morphing the DOM means you have a functional interface. So I actually think ClojureScript out of the box, if we had a native morphing feature, would be huge. You wouldn't need to go anywhere else. You could just there be like, I'm going to do functional UI development, and you don't actually need any external tools besides what's in the box. So CLJS, I'm 14 years old. I know I'm over, so I'm going to go quick. ClojureScript is not React. React is great. I think we've had a lot of success through React, and this is definitely not to say people that are succeeding with it, you should stop. But it's also not the only option. I have a personal interest now in a la carte morphing as a way to allow people to do lighter weight ClojureScript development. I mean, all of my old examples on my blog, they all pass Google Clojure Speed, the little performance test in Chrome. It's they all pass that speed test because all my blog posts don't have more than 20K of gzip JavaScript. I think adding a little bit of morphing allows people to be productive in a functional style. I also think that people are getting sort of tired of all the complicated tooling. For 5 years, I worked on a React Native ClojureScript app. And the tooling around React Native was the complexity of Xcode plus the complexity of React. I mean, it was a lot. I think you can get a lot done with simpler tooling. And again, I think there's this feeling, and I think there's a growing malaise. If the modern JavaScript story is so great, what's up with this overall sense of declining quality? There are people who are interested in this problem. You can look, Svelte is making its own corner of the JavaScript ecosystem. People are trying to get tree shaking to work, but for various reasons, as a language, as a community, people haven't adopted the practices that make this easy to be successful, right? In a world in which Lodash, right now Lodash is being downloaded 72 million times a week, right? In that world, you're not going to be able to achieve what I've said. It's going to take a lot of momentum to get the JavaScript community to stop working that way. I think ClojureScript is interesting because we don't have these sort of biases. We don't have these sort of a knee-jerk sort of cargo culting about this is the right way to do it, the way that often you encounter in the JavaScript world. So again, ClojureScript was one of the first communities to actually embrace React. That's something that people probably, it's now in the fog of the past. It's like we forgot that like we were the first people to go there because we saw a better way. And I think there's an opportunity now to take what we've learned. It's not like, again, it's not like there are not great lessons from React, but I think it's a great time now to revisit some of these things, and maybe there's a better way. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what it would take to, if you ship the compiler, just, I know it's huge and you could code split it, do you have a sense of what it would take to, like, if you compile something to reattach the namespaces so that you could compile and run against, your production Clojure? Does that make sense?
I mean, it's a thing you're talking. I mean, there's this thing now. I don't know. I just read it. Like every time I read a thing about some practice in JavaScript, we're like, is that a good idea? I don't know. But now there's this thing, what you're talking about in the JavaScript world. They call it micromodules. It's like a whole thing, micromodules, where people build completely independently compiled things and they're able to communicate. Again, I have a lot of reservations. It's literally something I read about today. I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. It is interesting, but in my basic opinion is that I think Google Clojure out of the box, what it does is it just does module splitting, and that their general idea that independent compilation in the end will never be as nice in terms of like optimizing for the final payload and for the sort of how little we send and what the user experiences. I believe that they are correct in that assessment. That's the way they do it. That said, it might be interesting if that really takes off, this micromodule idea. But again, I have very deep reservations, so I'm not going to say much more about that.